Do that. Thanks again. Let me just try to share. I'd like to say just at the beginning of this, before I go very much further, this is a real collaborative effort, and I've been working very closely with a number of colleagues, David Donnelly of Donnelly Law and Lorraine Johnson, working in native plants. Lorraine is an activist and an expert, and I'm also sharing some slides that Lorraine has developed. We do share a lot of our material and frankly, the efforts to provide education and support for municipalities looking to make changes to their bylaws effectively to promote environmental sustainability, biodiversity, and climate resilience. And so that's the context in which I'm offering this research. So I'd just like to share with you, if you bear with me for a moment. You should be able to see my screen right now. Everybody can see that, I hope?
Perfect. Yeah.
Excellent.
Thank you.
Excellent. The purpose of this exercise is to really look at using our bylaws that are well intended and have a long history of upholding something called property standards, which we might acknowledge that in an ethnoculturally diverse society is hard to agree on what those standards are. And we also want to make sure that they're legal and that they can, from the perspective of any councillor or CAO of a municipality, that they are not going to put the municipality in a position of added financial burden or offside with the law. And that's partly where we're coming from with this work. This started in a very personal way as well, and I'll tell you a little bit about that momentarily. The image that you see on to viewers left is actually my own house. Very lucky to have a sloped south-facing slope in the city of Toronto in Midtown, and that's where some of this work begins. Most of the research that you're going to hear about is carried out by myself and graduate students in my lab. That's the Ecological Design Lab at TMU, Toronto Metropolitan University. We work effectively at the intersection of landscape connectivity for movement of wildlife and species. That can be everything from pollinators to mammals. The intersection with people in cities through blue and green infrastructure, so purpose-designed and built infrastructure to help facilitate biodiversity and climate resilience. Those are the areas we work in. And more recently, in the last 4 years, we've been undertaking a serious look at bylaws and municipal bylaws across North America, and in particular in Ontario and Canada wider, in ways that these bylaws actually stand as a barrier to biodiversity. And the reason that we do this is that we know from the United Nations' own declarations and well-supported research that the single best tool we have to fight climate change is nature itself, or biodiversity. So we want to make sure that what we're doing in our cities actually enhances and supports biodiversity. And that's a key part of climate resilience. These things are integrated. For a long time, as you all will well know in the Climate Caucus, the work about climate resilience has been focused on carbon capture and storage and net zero and all that. And we've kind of forgotten about the other part of the equation. The entangled crisis is biodiversity, or the more technical term for the genetic variety and abundance of species on Earth that gets called nature. So these bylaws that we have in our cities can go a long way to either providing a barrier for biodiversity or a support. And we've created toolkits both for planners and for citizens or community members. And we've also created a model bylaw that can be used in Ontario under our legal jurisdiction to help municipalities come into compliance with recent court decisions, or actually even older court decisions, and at the same time help individual community members and property owners do the best for biodiversity right outside their doorstep. So that's, again, the motivation behind this work. You'll find all of this information on our website. The Ecological Design Lab is a repository for help for individual community members and counselors and planners, professional planners, looking to provide education and support for biodiversity through the bylaw system. So why are we talking about this in planning right now? Well, I've already mentioned that biodiversity is an important aspect of climate resilience, arguably the best toolkit we have to start with. And that is also framed in the way our cities can be perceived and act in terms of both their jurisdictions and their power. They can sometimes do a lot more than regional governments or even federal governments. And that's why, because we have the power to shape built form. So Toronto is a member of something called the Biophilic Cities Network. And the way to think about this is that our cities are places where both nature and people can thrive. And that's incredibly important at a time when our cities are growing very quickly. In most places of the world, they're much bigger than Toronto, and they're also on a direct collision course with some of the biodiversity hotspots on the planet and with nature at large. So we want to make sure that we're giving people an opportunity to be exposed to the benefits of nature in cities. And we can start that by some of the way we make our policies and our bylaws. And Toronto, as one of the 2 Canadian cities that is a member of the Biophilic Cities Network, is able to share information through bylaws and policies on how this can happen, not as a model for other cities, but as a tool for learning, and of course, exchange and sharing where our cities have something in common. We do a very good job on the public side of having strategies that support climate resilience and biodiversity. So everything from our pollinator protection strategy, the ravine strategy, our biodiversity strategy, these are emulated by cities all across North America. And without belaboring it too long, just remind us that Toronto has the first green roof bylaw in the continent. We also have the first bird safe guidelines that are now used by other cities who've actually surpassed us in terms of enforceability and real measurable targets. So Toronto has a good history here. However, it's all focused on the public realm. So what about the private citizen? There's a campaign out there that recognizes the way we keep our yards and gardens isn't very healthy. This is rather amusing campaign done by Healthy Yards organization, really puts a pin in it to say, if we've got a lawn that looks just like this as our only garden, that's kind of reminiscent of a time that's past. It's not particularly environmentally sustainable, and there are many other ways to make our yards and gardens biodiverse. The problem that we run into is the municipal code, or bylaws that are focused on property standards look a little bit more like this image than they do supportive of biodiversity. Our bylaws are a little bit stuck in the past, you might say. They go by different names, this chapter of the municipal code. In Toronto, it's chapter 489, was at one time, before we got involved in this, it was called the Long Grass and Weeds Bylaw. Many municipalities will have a bylaw that's called turf grass maintenance or weed bylaw or property standards, or sometimes they're just called property maintenance bylaws. But what's hiding behind that title are a couple of really key assumptions. Number one is that they have a statement about that your grass must be cut to a particular height. First of all, there's a flawed assumption in there in that we all have grass. Many people in many cosmopolitan cities in Canada right now don't have turf grass anymore for all kinds of reasons. Perhaps they have an aesthetic enjoyment of rose bushes, or maybe they like native flowering perennials, or maybe they want to support pollinators. Maybe they have a meadow. Maybe they grow vegetables in their front yard. Maybe they are a community cooperative that has chosen to have a food garden. So the idea that we all have turf grass, which by the way is a series of species imported from elsewhere, designed to be tight clumping, short clipped grass, that's a very outdated idea. And yet it still in many communities is considered the norm. This idea that we should be cutting the grass that some of us don't have is problematic because it stands in the way of growing species that are more ecologically sustainable and supportive of the biodiversity that we need for climate resilience. So that's the first problem. The second is that they almost always include a note about weeds, and they don't ever define what those weeds are. In Toronto, this image, we talk about ourselves as the city within a park, and yet in this image, what we see are trees and flowering plants with no real idea in our bylaws which of these species is allowed. We simply talk about them as grass and weeds. And those are not scientific terms. So if you're going to go to court to defend what that means, you're in trouble right away. You've got to be able to talk about specifically what is a weed. And many municipalities don't do that at all. This is an aerial image of an average midtown cross-section of Toronto. It happens to be of my neighborhood in Hillcrest, which is at Christie and Davenport, if anyone is from Toronto. And this is the site where we began to test some of the ideas. As an ecological designer, I was interested in understanding how the natural gardens and gardens that reflected the native biodiversity of a place were actually running afoul of bylaws. And it turns out that this started as far back as 1996. And this is a courtesy of Lorraine Johnson, but this is Sandy Bell's garden, who in 1996 was charged a fine. And the inspector who came to inspect her property charged her with having excessive growth. And what she went to court to defend was the idea that this was an environmentally sound garden. It had space for water infiltration, space for pollinating insects, overwintering habitat for small amphibians and reptiles. It has a habitat log in the front that is a place for other insects. So this was her idea of a good sound environment. And in fact, she won that court case. That's important to remember in 1996. Later on, Douglas Counter's garden in 2019 ran afoul also because he was growing plants that were too tall. So I don't think anyone gave the memo to these plants. And in court, we have evidence from experts who testified that, in fact, the growth habit of most plants that are native flowering varieties are much taller than 20 centimeters or 8 inches. There is no turf grass in this garden, and yet it was held to those same standards. And we can go on. There are lots and lots of these images. Lorraine has provided several here from Douglas Counter's swale garden in the right-of-way in Etobicoke. And this, of course, by the community, as you might expect, is seen not as an eyesore, but in fact as a contribution to community wellness and the beautification of the street. There are other examples too. Another one from Lorraine. This is Miriam Mutton's garden in Coburg. You can see the before and the afterwards. Oops, I didn't include the afterwards, but it's raised after the municipality forced her to cut it. And here, even in Windsor, just a couple of years ago, a young girl and her father grew sunflowers, and they were deemed as not compliant with the bylaw, and they were cut down. So some of these are almost funny because you can't imagine how something like this ran afoul of a bylaw simply because it didn't conform to the idea of being turf grass. And yet here in Hillcrest Meadow, we had the same problem. I decided to test this rather unwittingly. This, just to give you a quick idea, is our garden. And in the 25th of August, we were served with a notice of violation and instructed to immediately remove the long grass and weeds. When I asked the bylaw officer to kindly point out the weeds, they were unable to do so. I asked to point out where is the turf grass that needs to be cut. They were unable to do so. And again, I asked, well, which are the offending plants that you would like me to remove? They couldn't tell me which ones. So there's clearly a problem in communicating what is the problem here exactly. And the problem is that I don't grow a lawn. Milkweed, goldenrod, and asters appear to be the problem. But really the issue is that these gardens are deemed by some people to be too wild, too messy, too weedy, or just too much. But yet none of those terms are scientific, and they can't be defended in a court of law, as it turns out, because when we returned back to Sandy Bell in 1996, she already settled that court case. Justice Fairgraves agreed that this is a battleground. And in fact, people have every right constitutionally and in our charter to express their values through their lawn, or excuse me, their garden, right? Because we don't all have lawns. So this is an important point to remember, that this is about changing norms. And increasingly, people want to be given the opportunity, as it turns out, to do this very good work for climate resilience and biodiversity support on your own property. You shouldn't have to go to battle with the very same city who has policies to support these very same things on public land. So why then do they stand in the way? We decided to challenge this in court, and we asked the city first to define the bylaw. The problem is there's a vague terminology. There's no definition of grass, weeds, or even undesirable plants. And terms like overgrown, messy, or even exuberant, these are terms that are judgments of beautification and aesthetics. They're not scientific. So we asked the city to please provide these. We provided the legal precedent that this is unconstitutional. And as a result, we were able to have a meeting with the property standards division at the city and help them to work out these changes that we thought were necessary to the bylaw. We didn't actually have to go to court. And that's a really important point in what these news stories are telling you, is that there is considerable public dismay over this as well. And each community is probably different, but we walked in our neighborhoods. We had 14 students do this work over a year. And in the hundreds of streets we walked, we took photographs of the numbers of yards that actually had a turf grass lawn, and they were in the minority, considerably so in downtown Toronto. So the fact is that the bylaws are out of date. And when we invited the mayor at the time, Mayor Tory, to join us in the garden for a tour of understanding, this was something that we were able to communicate in, I think, a very less than adversarial way, despite the news media. We were able to ask the public at large how they felt about this and gain feedback from a survey that we then reported back to the city, that most people think you don't need a permit to grow a garden that is biodiverse and climate resilient. That should be the norm. And so we created a series of toolkits, bylaws, webinars that we held together with our colleagues, as I've mentioned, David Donnelly and Lorraine Johnson. There are many others who've been working on this, and we've been able to support other municipalities through the creation of a model bylaw. These toolkits have studied 14 municipalities across North America, and also to show ways in which municipalities can make changes that allow people as of right the opportunity to support biodiversity in their front yard. And yet there are still obviously some things that we need to pay attention to. And these are principally issues of health and safety. The first thing I want you to take away from this is that in municipalities across North America, height restrictions are universally common, but they're founded on the idea of there being turf grass in place. You don't have to have turf grass. There's nowhere does the bylaw say you must have it. There's an assumption built in. So that's something that has to change right away. We also have plenty of examples from across the city. These are from my students' research, where there are plenty of ornamental grasses, and yet no one asks us to cut them. They're not defined either. In nature, there are more than 12,000 species of graminoid. Why do we just have one that we have to cut? Well, when you have vague definitions of weeds and grass, you have a problem with compliance. It leaves this compliance up to interpretation by bylaw officers whose job descriptions have much more to do with keeping order in a city than just the garden. So of course they don't have training. They don't have training in plant recognition, certainly not in grass recognition, which even most ecologists would have trouble doing. So there's a real mismatch in terms of the enforcement and what the bylaws say. So most often we find in bylaws, there are terminologies that are aesthetic subjective judgments. So terms like unkempt or untidy are entirely up to the individual. These are in attempts to get at property standards, which we understand, but using a term like blight or excessive growth to plants whose normal habitat is much larger than 8 inches or 20 centimeters doesn't make a lot of sense. It also makes it next to impossible to interpret these in a way that's fair and equitable, particularly when you start to look at who is being targeted. We may very well have equity issues at risk, and that's something that's coming out in our research. We know that the third takeaway for you is that these municipal code or bylaw justifications are highly problematic because they directly contradict the sustainability goals that most cities now have. So if you're having biodiversity supportive policies on your public land, why are you punishing individual homeowners who are trying to do the same thing right outside their front door? We know that the aesthetic judgments are problematic because the court has already ruled that in Ontario. So we have a number of different examples from across Canada and the US where these are running afoul of the law, and it will only take one person who's determined to go to court to put the municipality on the hook. It's probably cheaper to fix your bylaw now than to wait to go to court, and I have several examples of where that's happened. The justifications for property standards bylaws that may have to do with something that we call order really has to do with health and safety. And the myth is that weeds, plants that grow out of the way that we want them to grow, any plant that we deem to be undesirable, there's a myth that they create a breeding ground for ticks or rodents or other pests or vermin. And we know that the evidence does not support that. Rats and mice in particular are attracted to garbage. Ticks are attracted to a particular kind of climate that when you have other animals coming in, other species like birds, they're well maintained and under control. So these are myths that we have already busted, let's say, and there's plenty of evidence to show that health and safety concerns really should focus on the visual sight line so that traffic is not impeded in some way, or that foot traffic, people can safely pass on the sidewalk. Those are the basic health and safety concerns, and that's where the bylaw can really do some help. So our recommendations to the City of Toronto and to other municipalities have effectively been, first and foremost, you don't need a permit to do the right thing. That should be normal. Lawns that require pesticide application, chemical treatment, high level of irrigation, we should be questioning the reliance on those. And that's a shift in thinking that has to happen. So yes, of course, people should be able to have a lawn if they wish, but it should not be deemed the only type of large yard that's acceptable. And it's certainly not one that's healthy. The evidence really supports that. We've recommended that you remove any reference to turf grass entirely because there's good evidence that the lawn is no longer the expected norm under a climate crisis. We definitely recommended that you remove any reference to height because we know the natural habit of these plants is greater than that. And then finally, in this sequence, restrict any control over these yards that individual property owners have to anything that can be demonstrated as a health risk. So health and safety, and that should include ecological health. So that means no invasive species. And let's define what those are. Those ought to be listed in the bylaw. We have ample evidence for what they are in each area's region. So those can be listed as prohibited or disallowed plants. But you can't just use the term blanket weeds. A weed is simply a plant growing in a place we don't want it to grow. That's not a definition that can be upheld in court. We've also asked communities to consult widely and extensively, not only with Indigenous members of the community, but with communities broadly. We may find that in certain areas, it's a norm to have a vegetable garden in the front, and we don't want to be cutting our tomato plants to 20 centimeters or our zucchinis to 20 centimeters. Anybody who's grown those plants knows that's hard to do and get a product from it. So these consultations should be about what does the neighborhood expect? And you cannot use terms of aesthetic judgment because they don't stand up in court. So Indigenous communities, for example, may have very specific plants that hold spiritual or medicinal value that should be encouraged and supported, not cut down because they grow taller than 8 inches, for example. We also really now in our emphasis and research are trying to track enforcement. We definitely see a correlation between enforcement in certain communities, and that's an equitable solution to this problem, to be targeting certain communities for the types of yards they have. There's a real risk there that we overstep equity and diversity. Finally, we've asked municipalities to consider changing the burden of responsibility, that when somebody calls in Toronto 311 to report an untidy, overgrown yard, that should right away be filtered out as a complaint that has no basis. Whereas if they call and they say, the plants are overhanging the sidewalk and my stroller can't pass by, or my wheelchair, I can't access the sidewalk, that's a different thing. That's health and safety. If someone says the hedge is obstructing the view from the stop sign and the cars aren't stopping because they can't see the sign, that's a health and safety issue. That has merit. So there's a way to filter these out, and that has to do with revising the complainant process. The results, quickly to wrap up, are to say that we've revised the Toronto bylaw as members of the subject matter expert committee to put in place a new bylaw that took effect on January the 1st, 2022. And we now have other municipalities that we've been working with. We've worked with Smiths Falls in a way that was not exactly conciliatory. We actually forced a court decision in that case. They're updating their bylaw, which was deemed to be unconstitutional. And the complainants were actually paid court costs. So that's a really important case to pay attention to. Not the complainants, excuse me, the defendants were awarded costs in this case. They were harassed by the town and by the community for 2 years before we were able to reverse that decision. Thunder Bay, Kingston, and London are all in the process of updating bylaws. We've had consultations with all 3 of those. Oakville is in question right now, but they have a pretty good bylaw. And Prince Edward County recently also updated their bylaw to reflect some of these changes. Each of them are slightly different, but all of them used advice taken from the model bylaw that we developed. The last thing I'll say is these problems are not going away. They're actually getting worse in some communities. We're not sure why that is, but it does seem to be that we've stepped into what might be deemed as, people who are really willing to try to do something for biodiversity and climate resilience, and those who want conformity with an aesthetic that is no longer the norm. Change is uncomfortable. People don't like it. The Smiths Falls case was really polarizing, and it was very hurtful to a community, I would say. And more recently, you may have seen some of the Burlington press on the Karen Barnes case. This is a case who is a woman who was force mowed and fined. Now the fine is standing at $10,000, which seems, let's just say, disproportionate for someone who's trying to grow a pollinator garden. The community is very unhappy with the aesthetic of this particular yard, but as I've pointed out before, if this goes to court, that is not an acceptable basis on which a bylaw will stand. So there's a risk to the municipality financially, there's a risk to the community in terms of its reputation, I would say, and there's a risk of not being climate compliant at a time when we know the evidence says otherwise. Right now, the emphasis is really trying to get enforcement into a place where it makes sense, that it's equitable, that it's scientific, and where the bylaw officers are actually receive training and support to be able to make interpretations that are reasonable. We haven't even talked about leaf blowers. That's a subject for another time, but it's next on the agenda. noise pollution and all the rest of it. Thanks so much for having me in to introduce a little bit of this to you, or to touch on it if it's something your municipalities might be facing. I can assure you it's the right thing to do from a climate and biodiversity perspective.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Nina Marie. Pat, take it away.
Yeah, I was able to get away quickly. City of Kawartha Lakes is looking at a bylaw, a change in their clean and clear bylaw. It doesn't say, well, I believe it doesn't say turf grass. So, and what the staff member has brought forward, it's called the long grass bylaw. So the folks in the Environmental Advisory Committee did not like that name for sure. But the long story short, it's actually going back to staff to look at through a economic development lens, and also to our local conservation authority for input into the bylaw. My question is, what's the name of the bylaw that you've put out there? I think a lot of it is in the name, like
you're absolutely right, Pat.
Long grass bylaw is not going to sell the product.
It's not going to solve the problem either,
No.
right? The assumptions that are built into that. I always start with, well, there are 12,000 species of braminoids or grass plants. Which one do you want to talk about? No one can answer, so that's not helpful. I think, so we did not settle on the name. We recommended names to the City of Toronto, and we now have the turf grass and prohibited plants bylaw. So it tries to strike a balance, I think, is the reasoning behind it, in that some people have turf grass, and then there are some prohibited plants we want to avoid for health and safety reasons. Now, has this problem been solved? And I would say categorically no. I'm just typing a little note to Diane Sachs here to say, yes, I'd like to work on this with the City of Toronto. We don't have very good enforcement. We still have, and I would say just very clearly, this is not to blame individual bylaw enforcement officers, but rather to point out that they are not supported. They don't have anywhere near the training they need to interpret this bylaw. They're responding to somebody who calls 311 and says, hey, there's a messy long grass and it's an eyesore in my neighborhood. That complaint should be filtered out right away. It's a waste of resources for them to send somebody out. They need to send somebody out when the complainant can say, oh, there's poison ivy in that front yard, I think. Or I think there's dog strangling vine, which is one of the 10 plants on the prohibited plant list. Why? Because it is an invasive species, and because it's on the Ontario noxious weed list, which some municipalities refer to. The problem with referring to the Ontario weed list under the Weed Act is that many of those don't have bearing or relevance in cities. So there's a little disconnect there. It may be more relevant for municipalities to name their bylaws about what they don't allow, which is prohibited plants or invasive species. We can't, as it turns out, legally regulate what your yard looks like. So let's try to back away from those subjective terms that are tangling up enforcement. It's also, I want to say, just really, really stigmatizing to people to be singled out in their neighbor when they've worked very hard in many cases to provide an educational yard that has sometimes seedlings exchanged with others. They're trying to do something right for the environment, and they end up getting singled out, and some of them just give up. So we run into a lot of complainants that come to us for help and then say, I can't take it. My neighbors hate me. I'm singled out in my neighborhood, or the city is just hounding me and harassing me, and I'm traumatized by it, which is not an understatement. Just one last anecdote. Douglas Counter, the person whose yard I showed earlier, who's built this beautiful rain garden and native pollinator patch, on the very same day that he had the City of Toronto's Pollinate TO staff and volunteers show up to his house for a tour, he was served with yet another violation notice. So, the mismatch here is significant. And the biggest thing I want to emphasize is just a huge drain on city resources. We've got to find a better way to do enforcement. And part of that is naming the bylaw about the thing we want to control, which we're actually legally allowed to, not the thing we imagine would be nice.
Thank you. Still have to. I've put the naming out to a few different people to come up with some ideas to sell it a little bit better.
I
So
mean, you know, we have pollinator policies for public land, but for private land, what these bylaws are supposed to do is regulate what you can and can't do. And really what
Yeah.
we talk about is what's not allowed, not what is
Yeah.
allowed. And so
Yeah.
focus on the thing that we have the capacity and the interest in really regulating. And I doubt when you speak to most people that they really want to see our tax dollars going to officers to run around measuring the length of grass that somebody has to come in and mow. I mean,
I know it's
right.
I mean, we have a bee city. We're all almost having a bird friendly municipality. I mean, this just goes hand in hand with all of that, and a climate plan also. So thank you.
Yes, exactly. Thank you so much.
Perfect. Any other questions for Nina Marie? And thank you so much for creating a model bylaw. I can't like I'm sure the municipalities is so helpful to have something to start from, because trying to recreate this and do this research over and over again in each municipality is a waste of resources, both human and financial resources. So I'd also probably say that it's probably a good idea as you're advancing this to bring your legal folks into the conversation, because if they see that the precedence is such that if a municipality is taken to court and this is not enforceable in a court of law, that all the court cases that have brought this to court have not sided with the old bylaw and the way it was written. I think that's going to have a really big input in terms of building the support you'll need across your municipality for updating the bylaw.
It's a big gamble to go to court on this, both for the individual who bears that cost and the municipality as a risk if they lose. So that's a big part of the messaging that we've been putting out there. But most of it, frankly, is focused on education to help people understand that your idea of a messy yard is not your neighbor's idea of a healthy, thriving, and flourishing biodiverse yard, right? It's really about education. Please feel free to look at the Ecological Design Lab website. You'll find it easily in Google. And all of the materials are free for download, and with great credit to the colleagues I mentioned earlier. It's a real collaborative effort. Thanks very much for having me today, Gabby, and be in touch.
Thank you so much, Nina Marie. Really appreciate it. Thank you.